Okay. Thank you so much to the technical crew who is diligently working to make sure that we have all of the visuals and everything that we need. We are starting a couple minutes late, so I will be sure to move swiftly because I will not be the person who's standing in between you and lunch. Definitely will not be. So hello everyone, my name is Bree and welcome to Styled and Sassy, choosing the right React styling solution. So I am a developer advocate at HubSpot, and prior to being a developer advocate, I was a front-end engineer for about 6 years. I've had the opportunity to work on a variety of different projects that have led me to all of the different styling solutions that we're going to be talking about today. So in my free time, I make technical content online, which basically means I like to yap on the internet, and I do it in video form on TikTok and like Instagram. But I also like to show people that there is not one specific right way to be or to become an engineer. And I also really enjoy creative coding and making things with CSS because the internet is a place where things can also be pretty. So I'm super excited to talk with y'all today about some of the current popular styling solutions that are available in React. And we're going to discuss things like CSS modules, CSS utility frameworks, mostly Tailwind, and CSS in JS solutions like styled components. So this is a talk where you're probably going to leave with more questions than you had at the beginning, and that's totally expected. I don't intend for you to leave our time together fully sold on one specific styling solution or trying to change your methodology of how you're already currently styling your React applications. So we're going to discuss a framework for choosing the right React styling solution. But like most things in tech, it's not going to be one size fits all. So today we're going to discuss the solutions, and we're going to get into how easy they are to customize, how well they perform, how easy they are to maintain and scale, how well they can be integrated into your current developer workflow and the teams that you're currently working on, and a framework for how you can decide on which styling solution might be right for you. So I love this topic for a variety of different reasons, but one of them is because people have very strong opinions about styling. So before we dive in, we're getting to know each other. I want to talk about some developer opinions. Does anybody use TikTok at all? Yeah? Okay, well, one thing that's currently going around on TikTok is people hanging out with their friends and saying, we listen and we don't judge. So does anybody have a developer opinion, popular or unpopular, that they want to share? And then I'll share mine. You can just yell it out. Vanilla? You like vanilla CSS? I like it. You like Tailwind? I like it. Okay. We listen and I think we can all agree on that. Yes. And for everybody online, this person said Bootstrap is awful. I think we're all in agreement with there. Mine is I really like CSS and JS. We listen and we don't judge. So I've been on tech Twitter since about 2018, or I guess tech X at this point. And like I said, if there's one thing developers have, even if y'all all didn't share yours, I know that you probably have a lot of opinions. And we basically find a different technology or a different method of doing something, and it clicks for us and it makes sense. And we grapple onto that and we really use it. So one of the most interesting debates I've seen revolves around how we're currently styling our applications with CSS and how we might do that in the future. But like I said, in tech, it's not a yes or a no. It's going to be it depends. And these things are really influenced by our project needs, the project scope, deadlines, skill level, and sometimes people forget it's about personal preference and how you choose to style your applications. So all of those pieces help us to inform our own opinions and really think critically about the tools that we're using, but more so engage in critical conversations that are helping to make that technology better as well. So let's consider that I have asked you to create this pink button. Show of hands, who is just going to use vanilla CSS to do it? Expected, I like that. Who's going to use Tailwind or like a CSS, or not CSS and JS, a framework library? Awesome, okay. I'm scared to ask, but is anybody going to reach for CSS and JS or styled components to make this button? Okay, I like it. So what if I told you that this isn't just a one-off button, that you're going to need to reuse this button across multiple different projects or across multiple different teams? And maybe your teams are kind of big and you work on a very large scale application. So it's not just like one or two teams, Or maybe I tell you that this button is actually a part of a component library, not just a single application that it's going to be using. And it has to have different variations of color or of size or of text and everything like that. Or even furthermore, what if I told you that the style can be influenced by the parent components that it's in? So when we think about things like light mode or dark mode or having different themes, vanilla CSS can indeed do all of this for us. There's no doubt about that there. But when our code gets more complex and our requirements start to stack up, it kind of can get difficult to maintain. And especially when you're going from one developer to another, things can get lost in translation. So that's where some of these tools can really come in helpful. I don't think anybody's out here trying to replace vanilla CSS, but more so have ways to work with it a little bit better. So let's start with talking about CSS modules. So CSS modules are the more traditional way that we can write CSS, where they are basically scoped CSS files that are scoped to a specific component. So this really allows us to prevent affecting styles in components globally. And they're, like I said, more traditional way to write CSS. And this works by having an object where the keys and class names are defined in the CSS. And we use a tool like Webpack in order to help us build and create hashed identifiers that is all processed into one single CSS file. So for each of the different options that I'm going to be talking about, on the, left-hand side, it's going to show sort of what the CSS for that pink button might look like in each specific option. So this is standard. We are used to seeing this for the most part. So when we get into Tailwind, things look a little bit different and it's a little bit more slim. So CSS utility frameworks like Tailwind or Bootstrap, if you're familiar, they basically offer us a utility-first framework for styling. So instead of writing custom CSS like we saw in the last example, we're going to be using predefined utility classes for things like padding, margin, colors, and everything like that. And we're going to apply it directly to our HTML in the class. So this works by using atomic design to create very small single-purpose classes. And each class represents a single CSS property. So during development, CSS frameworks they generate a comprehensive CSS file. So when we are developing, this is going to build every single option of a class that we might potentially need. And it's also going to use a Tailwind configuration file to help us do so for things that are custom, like maybe we have custom colors or we've included custom fonts. But during production, what happens is Tailwind uses a purge feature to kind of tree shake and only use the classes that we actually need in our project, which makes the final bundle a lot smaller. And then we can move on to CSS in JS, things like emotion, but we're mostly going to be talking about styled components. Now, this is an approach where you write CSS directly in your JavaScript files, and it's often the same file as your components. So when we think about CSS and JS, one of the biggest criticisms is that everything now lives in the same file. Your markup, because you have your JSX, your logic, and now your styling. And that can be a definite turn-off moment for some people. So this works by scoping styles directly to components, which means that it won't affect other components. Where's my, oh, I lost my mouse, my bad. And basically what happens is the styles are converted to CSS rules, and they're given unique class names, and they're injected into the DOM at runtime. So each styled component generates that unique CSS rule set, and it's inserted directly into the head. So now that we know a little bit about some of the styling solutions that are available, we can start gathering some facts to really understand where each styling solution might shine. So let's start with one of the most important questions when we're thinking about making websites, making them pretty, of course, is how easy is it to customize a theme? So for CSS modules, when you're using them, in order to customize a theme, you have to import each theme and pass the active theme to the component that you want it to go to. This can get really cumbersome for large-scale applications or maybe apps that use more than one or two themes. For CSS utility frameworks like Tailwind, they do support theme configuration that takes place inside of the Tailwind config. It allows you to extend and customize the default theme that's provided, or you can override it completely and create your own. And with the power of CSS variables, you can actually create multiple themes, which is really cool. The Tailwind Labs YouTube channel has an excellent video on how to do this. And for CSS and JS, or styled components basically offers built-in support for theming via the theme context, or the theme provider, excuse me, which is going to use the context API. So this is really excellent for theme switching and creating components that are context aware. And because styled components allows arbitrary input as interpolations, something that we really need to be careful about is making sure that we're sanitizing the CSS, because we don't want CSS injection to become a security risk. So we're developers, and a lot of times we make our decisions based on numbers. So how do some of these solutions compare in terms of performance? Well, for CSS modules, the initial load time is pretty quick because the CSS is bundled and linked directly into the HTML. So everything can be loaded in parallel. And because this is just one CSS file that's static, it can also be cached by the browser for subsequent visits. And in terms of runtime performance, it's just a static class or a static file with class name, so there really is no overhead. For Tailwind, our initial load time, we can use features like purge, like I was talking about a few seconds ago, in order to shake out the classes that we don't need. And this, combined with minification and network compression, can usually lead to CSS files that are under 10 kilobytes, even for larger projects. And just like CSS modules, these Tailwind classes can also be cached in a single file for subsequent visits. Now, CSS and JS, the performance is something that is usually one of the biggest pain points also for people who are considering. So because these styles are co-located inside of JavaScript, they have to be parsed and executed by the browser, which can add a little bit of JavaScript overhead. So in terms of caching, the classic CSS files, like we talked about a couple seconds ago, can be cached, but because we don't have those classic .css files with CSS and JS, there's nothing that can be cached, so it has to be generated each time. So they calculate based on runtime values, and this isn't really a problem too much in smaller applications, but as you grow and scale, it can be a little bit of an issue. So I ran a very rough, very quick experiment just because I was curious one day about seeing what people's pain points about performance were. So I set up a really very basic experiment where I populated a row or a table with 1,000 rows and just randomly styled the cells. So I did this in a code sandbox environment just for consistency, and I measured from the time that I opted to show the table to see exactly to see exactly how the performance was affected. So what I found is that styled components took the longest out of the 3 to be executed. Now, after everything I've said, this is not we knew that this was going to happen. So it has the highest scripting overhead because of the dynamic generation of the styles, but it does benefit from a low rendering time once the styles have already been applied. So Tailwind has the advantage of faster scripting because of its pre-computed styles. And then CSS Modules is a middle-of-the-ground approach with moderate scripting, rendering, and paint times. And they benefit from static styles and scoped class names, making them less performance-intensive than CSS and JS, but sometimes more efficient than Tailwind. So we don't make decisions solely based on what we need for right now. At least we're not supposed to. We can't see into the future, but sometimes we can try to gauge and see what things we might need in our applications later. And in order to do that, I think we ask 2 big questions a lot of time. Number 1 is, how easy is this project to maintain? And number 2 is, how is it going to scale? You don't want to spend all of your time implementing a solution only to realize that it is a burden or a big pain in order to support. And then on the other side of that, you also don't want to implement a solution and then realize you're going to outgrow it almost right after you've implemented it. So let's take a look at some of the maintainability and scalability of our solutions. So for CSS modules, I'm pretty sure this is the most natural debugging for any styling options that we're used to. Number 1, it's natural to us to go into the dev tools and see what's going on. And there are all kinds of widely accessible developer tools that help us to debug CSS. So CSS modules encapsulate their styles and make it easy to maintain for the most part. However, if you're not very careful, you can find yourself creating a large and sort of monolithic CSS file if you just keep adding things to it, which I'm not saying I've done it before, but I'm saying it has happened. When we think about Tailwind, I think that too many classes can make your markup noisy. And this is the one biggest thing that I hear from people who they're interested in it, but they cannot get past the long class names. So typically in terms of debugging, it's pretty manageable because it's basically just single CSS rules inside of like one class. So the same thing as CSS modules where it's very easy, very like natural to debug. And I think it's really nice to have a single source of truth, which is the tailwind config.js. That's going to have all of your design tokens and then prevent issues with inconsistent design. So you do need to establish good patterns when you're using Tailwind. I personally was one of those people who had a really, really hard time getting past, why do I have 25 class names on this one element? I can't read it, and I don't want to read it. However, somebody gave me the really good advice of thinking about Tailwind as an extension or trying to use it and leverage it in order to create a mini component library or design system within your projects. And what this really did, coming from somebody who worked on a design system, is it kind of flipped how I was thinking about Tailwind. Originally, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to put all the class names on the elements that I want. It works, but it's very verbose. And in thinking about it like a design system, when I think about a design system, I'm like, okay, how small can I make this? What are those pieces that I can make literally as small as they can and then build them back up? And that really helped me to be more comfortable with Tailwind and make it a lot easier to debug, to maintain, and to pass things off to like different members of my team. So I had the opportunity to be on Learn with Jason Langsworth, and we actually talked about this because he himself did not like Tailwind. I don't know if he has changed his mind a little since we talked about it, but we actually had a really good conversation where I kind of showed him what my method for doing this was. So if you're interested in it, but you maybe want to like take a look at a potentially different approach, this is actually a really good video to watch, and it's just on YouTube. And for CSS and JS, I will say that debugging can be a little bit of a pain. CSS and JS styles are dynamically generated and injected into the DOM, so it can be really hard to trace back problems to the source of where they are. But like many libraries, this one offers source maps and different kind of dev tools to make it easier, but it does make the DOM very, very noisy. The second thing that I want to call out is in terms of maintenance, style conflicts can occur and be also very difficult to debug, especially when we're thinking about using it with things like Tailwind. So maybe you want to integrate CSS and JS into your project, but it's not a one-for-one, we're just scrapping everything and now we can just have new styles. Sometimes it is a slow iteration progress, and having those two things together work requires a lot of patience. And because the styles that you create in CSS and JS are likely going to rely on the props or state of your components, it can be a little bit tricky to debug those as well. So one tool that I always recommend, especially when using CSS and JS, is a tool like Storybook, where you can see and test different prop permutations, that's hard, in one place in isolation completely outside of your app. That way you're not relying on certain user flows in order to make sure that your app is working properly. So few things in this industry are consistent, but one of them is change. And while I welcome change, a change that is going to have a lot of setbacks for my team or make their job a lot harder is not one that I want to introduce. So how easy is it to integrate these styling solutions into tools that you're already using or into your development workflow? And what does collaboration look like? So for CSS modules, I think it's the most widely supported. We have a ton of different tools and frameworks that we can use it with. For Tailwind, it is also very widely supported, and currently at the time that I took this screenshot, there was about 20 different frameworks that were supported. And CSS and JS is a growing ecosystem, but it's not exactly as widely supported just yet. So as React evolves, CSS and JS tools will also evolve with it. But one place where it has a little bit more growing to do is server-side rendering. And it is currently an area of interest. So Style Components supports Styled components supports current server-side rendering. That's a hard sentence. With style sheet rehydration. And the basic idea is every time you render an app on the server, you can create a server style sheet and add a provider to your React tree that accepts it via the context API. So the official documentation, number one, it's always changing because this is something that is currently in progress. And if you have any questions about that, I think the documentation is the best place to go. And how easy is it to integrate onto teams that you're already on? So maybe you work with a designer, or maybe you are a designer. How easy is it to integrate these tools into things like Figma? So I think Tailwind really shines here because it has an official Figma library that you can use to streamline your work. And I love this because it really simplifies the communication between developers and designers and makes sure that everybody is on the same page. And also, like I said, I really recommend Storybook as well because it just makes working between teams so much easier, and being able to develop something like a component in isolation without having to have a whole team or a whole page can really simplify the process. So I will speed through this part because I know I only have a couple seconds left. But with everything that we've discussed, and we didn't even have time to discuss things like testing or browser accessibility, how do you kind of take all of that information and decide what to do for your application, or how do you use that information to inform your decisions? So the idea to integrate is probably going to mean a slow integration, and it requires careful planning to make sure that you're not disrupting any current workflows. And based on your code base, some decisions won't be, like I said, a yes or a no, but it depends. And it's going to depend on your team's expertise, project requirements, performance needs, and long-term maintainability. And the key here is really to weigh the trade-offs and choose a path that aligns with what your team's needs are, where they are personally, without necessarily having to do a lot of upskilling, and also balancing in the user experience and developer experience as well. So this is, I won't go through the whole thing, but when I was thinking about why you might choose one solution over the other, rather than just saying it depends, I kind of thought about different scenarios. That's kind of small, but a couple of them are, if I wanted to build something really, really fast, I'm going to go for a CSS utility framework like Tailwind, because it allows me to build and prototype super quickly without having to put in a lot of work. But if I wanted to do more complex styling that relies on props and state permutations, then I would reach for something like CSS and JS. It does have a bigger cliff at the beginning, and there is maybe a little bit more of a learning curve, but in the end, it is going to be a lot cleaner for those more complex state and prop permutations and styling. Something I used, which is actually what led me to CSS and JS, was working on a design system. We were previously doing it with Sass, and I'll tell you, once we moved over to CSS and JS, I was a much happier developer. But yeah, so I don't have a whole ton of time left, but you don't have to read all of this, but it's basically just a thought dump of some things that I'm trying to balance when I'm thinking about how or why I would choose a solution. So in wrapping everything up, CSS Modules basically offers scope styles, and it's more familiar for us. It's basic CSS syntax, and it's an excellent choice for anybody who's trying to avoid global styling conflicts and be a little bit more traditional. And CSS utility frameworks like Tailwind are all about speed and consistency, and they really allow for rapid development, and they promote consistent design across all of your applications. And then for CSS and JS, or styled components, it really offers you the most flexibility and dynamic and context-aware styling, but it does have a little bit of a cliff when it comes to learning and getting the hang of it. And the last thing is, I was really inspired to do this talk because of the State of CSS survey, and it actually just recently came out, and I was going to integrate some pieces in, but I'm glad I didn't because I'm already over time. If you ever have the time, I highly recommend you just take a look at the State of CSS survey. It's really interesting and thought-provoking to see what people are currently using, what they're not using anymore, or maybe even learn about some CSS properties that you literally didn't know existed. So I definitely think it's worth grabbing a coffee and just taking a look at this year's and maybe even comparing it to last year's. So thank you, everyone. I super appreciate it, and I super appreciate this community as well for having me. And yeah, feel free to connect.